Hey guys, welcome to the Discovering Eden podcast. I'm Jonathan,
And I'm Brandon.
and today we are talking about something very exciting. Woo! One of the very first things that we bonded over when we first met was our writing. And today we're going to dive a little bit into Brandon's writing, particularly one of the stories that he's been working on for a long time, but as well as some other things that he's written. And I'm really excited to kind of hear his thoughts, hear what he's put to paper, and just see what happens with this conversation. But before we get into it, as always, we want to pray and just ask for God to lead us in this discussion.
All right.
Dear Lord, we just thank you for this time that we get to meet each week and kind of just geek out about all these different things that we're super passionate about, whether it's games, whether it's books, whether it's movies, and in this case, our own writing. So we just pray that Lord, you guide this discussion, that you lead us in the direction that you want us to go, and that any and all who are watching take something away from this. And anything that we say that isn't from you, Lord, that it falls to the ground and is forgotten. Again, we just thank you for this opportunity to not only talk to each other, but to a wider audience. And we're just excited to get into it. Amen. Let's hit that bumper.
One does not simply walk into a bumper. Hit the wrong thing.
All right. So as I kind of prefaced earlier, we're going to be talking about Brandon's story today. So yeah, Brandon, before we kind of dive into the overarching narrative that you've been working on for a long time,
Just a little.
just a little bit, will you kind of just enlighten me a little bit about your writing experience, kind of how has writing shaped your life? What have you worked on over the last few years besides the story?
So I feel like this is probably similar to most people. In school, I didn't like writing in the slightest. Mainly because you're forced to write something that you don't necessarily want to talk about.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, it's very academic in that kind of sense. And so, like, when people are like, oh, I don't want to write a 2-page paper, then I look at that and laugh now because you look at how many pages I have. Oh, I'm only at page 238 or something like that. And it's just like, oh, now, of course, that's over years of time. But it's kind of funny because I feel like writing the story, even though I did it kind of just I wouldn't say pass the time, but I did it out of just kind of boredom.
Sure.
And just out of curiosity because I liked some of the other influences, and we can get into that later.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I gradually got better and better at writing the more I did it, which, practice makes perfect. Whoa! So, yeah, honors English, all those kind of things. I was reading college level stuff in elementary. It's just that kind of thing.
For sure.
And then that kind of shaped kind of how I wrote because I wrote in the same styles as a lot of my favorite authors, Tolkien being chief among them, which is why we talked about what we did. Love Lord of the Rings, love Tolkien's works, just the fantasy nature of it. And though Tolkien didn't really write in such a poetic kind of style, I find like a lot of my writing kind of reflects more of a poetic imagery kind of base and all.
Yeah, and I kind of wanted to dive into that a little bit. You say poetic imagery, kind of that almost poetic prose.
Yeah.
So besides this big story that we're obviously going to dive into, have you done any poetry, over the years? Is that something you've worked on, dabbled in?
Yeah, so I actually have done poetry. I actually published some
Good
poetry,
for you.
um, particularly one that I did in like seventh grade because it was like seventh grade English class. It was like at the corner of like my attention. It's like, oh, they have a prize for anybody who comes in like first place or something like that. I'm like, oh, cool. And we send it to like the library in like Maine.
Yeah.
And you would do something like that. So, believe it or not, I have the book here that I have it published in. It's 2010,
Okay.
so it's a bit of a time ago. But this is from when I was in seventh grade. So, is it my best poem? No, no, it's not. But I have done a lot of poetry in more recent years, and I find that it takes more of a religious or faith-based
Interesting.
stance. I've done haikus, I've done like a variety of different poetry, but obviously the poetic prose is kind of more my bread and butter.
Sure.
But I do like some of my haikus.
And you're not a fan of rhyming?
Not ideally. I've tried it. I'm not the biggest fan of
And
rhyming.
I can understand that. I would agree with that. Just from my own personal experience, rhymes aren't my thing. But why don't you share us this poem that you've written?
And you'll see like some of this rhymes, but it's like non-intentional.
Sure.
And I see that I end the lines with like the same word multiple times.
Yeah.
So is it great? No. But anyway, I'll read it for what it is. It's called The Shadow.
Okay.
So, a faded gray figure standing right there. Walking, stalking, listening figure right there. It follows me wherever I go. It's on the prowl. I'm not laughing at all. It scares me. Terrifies me. Stoic as can be, he creeps up to me. Lights out. It's gone. My eyes open wide as I look outside, but all I see is the moon. Confused as can be, I soon will see it is just watching over me.
Now, I think you beat yourself a little bit up about that, saying, oh, this isn't my best. And, it might not be, your best compared to what you've written now, but I don't think it's bad at all in the slightest. So props to you for getting something in a book and published. That's awesome. Yeah. So what is some of the influence on that poem in particular? What are some of the things that
I know, like, during the time I was writing it, we were in something at school where we were talking about like soldiers.
Okay.
Soldiers at
that
war.
would that makes sense, yeah.
So it's like soldiers at war, and so it holds like a little bit of that I'm scared of the dark kind of thing because you never know what's gonna come out.
Sure.
But it also kind of speaks to almost a camaraderie, even though it's just a shadow.
Yeah, well, I mean, your shadow's always with
Yeah,
you, right?
your shadow's always with you. It's not gonna forsake you.
For sure.
So again, it kind of takes that narrative. It seems a little dark in places, but I think that was more in the influence of the. I don't even really remember what the lesson was really on.
And that's fine.
It's
just curious.
in that vein.
Yeah. And you wrote this back in seventh grade, if you just said that. And that kind of brings me to this next topic, and kind of the big topic that I know we're going to talk about, which is this story that we've been talking about for a long time. And I know when we first started talking, kind of interacting with each other, a lot of that discussion revolved around our own writings.
Yeah.
And you had mentioned to me that this story has been in the works for a long time, even before this poem. Came about.
Before this poem even came out.
Can you kind of give just a little mini, like, brief history lesson on when did this start? what was the inspiration? Yeah, the influence kind of that drove you.
Honestly, it's a little odd as to its start. So I started in fifth grade. Which is, it's crazy looking back because it's been in the works for decades.
Yeah, it's the end of 2024. I mean, it's been a hot minute.
It's been a while. My first initial like take on it,
Yeah.
before I scrapped it all, lasted all of 3 pages.
Oh, solid.
Before I'm like, wow, this is trash, and scrapped it, except for 2 things.
Okay.
2 characters, if you will, which is Ariel and Larissa, which you'll see in the main story.
Yeah, and we'll get to characters in a little bit.
And Ariel used to actually be a male character before I switched it to female.
Interesting.
So in my main story that I'm working on right now, Ariel, the main character, is a female, which again is also a different take. And so Larissa is also female.
Now, just because you prompted a question for me, and so I don't want to cut you off because I still want to hear the rest of this answer, but was there a reason you switched her from a male to a female? Was it just kind of this snap judgment thing?
Initially, because how I wrote the first story, it was Ario, A-R-I-O,
Okay.
was the male lead at the time, saving Larissa. So it's basically knight on a quest to save a princess in the castle, kind of your typical, yeah. And it was trash, so I trashed it.
Okay, good to know. So continuing on with kind of that answer, the original question, if you remember where you were even going before I rudely cut you off.
Yeah. So
influences, kind of the inspiration behind it, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So obviously that was the start. That was the first bit.
Yeah.
And really it started from a dream that I had.
Interesting.
So I had a dream where I was able to talk to some characters, and I don't know if it was driven by different things that I was reading at the time or what, but it seemed very real. And some of the imagery that you'll see in my story reflects some of what I saw in the dream.
Okay.
Now, can I remember the dream in detail to the point of what exactly happened? No. I mean, it was decades ago. But it was that party of people, like the dwarf, the elf, all that kind of thing. And it could have been an influence from Tolkien. Of course it could have. But at that time, I never actually read the books of Lord of the Rings. Because I started writing the book before I read Lord of the Rings. But as I read the Lord of the Rings, it heavily influenced the direction it would go.
How so?
As in, you take the journey. So
Gotcha.
it's the journey first, that you have an eventual plot. But it's that journey at the beginning. So like Fellowship of the Ring journey. And I find that that's kind of how I wrote it. Especially since the way I wrote it was a little bit different than I think a lot of people. Because I didn't have an outline when I started. I experienced things the way my characters experienced it.
But sometimes I think that's the best way to go about it, because coming from somebody else has written before, every outline I've done dramatically changed throughout the course of the story. It's almost better to just let's see what happens.
I mean, now I have like a general outline, but it's very skeletal.
Yeah.
In its structure.
And I think that's what you need, though. I mean, if you're going to have an outline, keep it bare bones. You kind of know where it's going, but
it leaves room for the characters to kind of speak life into the story. So I'm basically my main character at that point, where I'm experiencing the same ebbs and flows as they experience.
For sure. So let's kind of not change direction, but before we dive any deeper, what is the basic, if you have a title for your story, for your series, whatever, what would you call it? What would you tell the watchers at home?
I mean, for the longest time, I didn't have a title. Mm-hmm. It just said my story.
I think, they'll put that on the shelf. My story, Brandon Dudler. Is it a memoir? I don't know.
Who knows what it
It's
is?
actually just a fantasy.
No, so I did some thinking, and obviously it's a working title, so it's not like set in stone. So the series, as I would call the series, because it'll be multiple books, which of course I don't even have one done yet,
That's okay.
but because it gets usually put on the back shelf or the back burner. But so the series I've called it is The Winds of Change.
Now, can you speak a little more into what does that mean? I mean, I don't want you to go into super in-depth spoilers if that's not what you want to do. But
It's not really spoilery. I would say, in life, we have a lot of transitions. We have a lot of things that change. Some we expect, some we don't expect. So, in a way, this story is kind of going in the midst of all that, saying, this is the life of a character or characters where these winds have changed, have greatly altered what their reality or what they see has been over the course of a journey.
Yeah. So before we get into characters too, and kind of, maybe you can enunciate even further on that series title with that change in the characters. What is, just so that I fully understand, I can better ask questions, what is like the dust jacket blurb that you would give for your story, if you have one?
I would say, like, at least for the first book.
Yeah, and that's kind of
that's all I've currently written.
Yeah, so that's what I wanted to focus on, anyways.
Is basically self-discovery. It's basically a character learning more about herself.
Yeah.
And recognizing her place in the world and why her existence is important.
Interesting. So there's this little knot of purpose in there.
Yeah, there's this knot of purpose in there. And obviously you'll understand why, but obviously some of that is linked into plot, which I'm not going to fully dive into because I kind of wanted to leave some spoilery stuff out of it. But obviously I can talk about some of these.
Yeah, so what is kind of the basic plot without, getting too in-depth into spoilers? What is the, what's our preview?
I mean, the preview is at like the beginning of the story.
Yeah.
They're basically, the character is, I wouldn't say feels uneasy.
Yeah.
But there's kind of like, I feel like I should be doing more. Like, what's my purpose in life?
Yeah.
And basically, a journey starts sparked by a vision that she has.
Yeah.
And that vision leads her away from the village that she was basically raised in and starts this quest to kind of just figure out her purpose until, the winds change.
Yeah.
Stuff happens.
There's the series title. He said it. Boom. Yeah, so I you mentioned a vision. I know we've talked a little bit about this. I feel like this is a good time before we kind of, go deeper into the conversation. I know you had an excerpt you wanted to share.
A couple. I have a couple.
You've got a couple. I'm assuming when you say vision, you're referring to something in, correct me if I'm wrong, the prologue.
No.
Really? Okay.
No, the vision is not.
I thought I had just made the easiest transition ever, but I didn't.
It is not. The vision actually happens in chapter 2.
Okay.
But I can, because the prologue, I think, shows a lot more of the poetic prose.
Yeah.
In the narrative style of it.
Sure.
And chapter 1, at least a little bit that I have, because basically chapter 7 and down it leaves stuff to be desired, as in it needs some work and overhaul, because that's kind of the remnants of 5th and 6th grade me.
Okay.
As in, there's not a whole lot of change there. There's little bits and pieces that are good that I reworked later on. And you'll see that, like, part of the chapter 7 excerpt that I'll read.
For sure.
And then the prologue is more of a recent installation, and you can see how vastly different it reads than the rest of it. There's only the one bit that remained from the middle school prologue, because I had a prologue initially to fulfill actually a class for creative writing
Interesting.
in high school.
Okay.
So only one paragraph of that remains, which is the very first paragraph. I did not change it. Not a single word I changed.
And I think that's rare for a lot of people, myself included. I tend to change a lot.
Yeah,
And so
I tend to change a lot as well. So
But it's interesting
for
to
me to
see-
say that like the prologue right now, I say it's done.
Yeah. And you mentioned that this kind of is a showcase of that poetic prose. So do
Yeah.
you want to kind of share that with not only myself, but the audience watching at home?
Yeah, and obviously, like I was timing myself reading all three of my excerpts. It takes like 8 minutes.
Yeah,
or
so let's start
like
with the
that.
prologue, and
But yeah,
we'll get to
we'll,
the other
we'll go
ones as we
into the
go.
prologue, and then we can even dive into some of the other stuff.
For sure.
So again, this is kind of showing that imagery. Like I want people to picture it.
Mhm.
Even as I was writing some of these things, like I'm reading it or not reading it. I'm writing it as if I'm like watching a screen.
Yeah.
I'm watching.
You're almost you're watching a movie.
I'm watching everything unfold, and I want people to be able to kind of immerse themselves in it.
For sure.
I mean, that's the goal. So, without further ado, so this is literally taken right from the beginning as going down. I skip nothing. I do cut it off at a certain point. I'll cut off there, but I'll go. So it starts. Dark in a forest of ancient likeness, stars glittered like jewels scattered amidst an expansive abyss. The moon, carved into a jagged crescent, illuminated the ground below, casting its brilliance upon the forest leaves as they whistled against the brisk evening breeze. Within the forest, the trees bent with reverence, sighing as time progressed forward, bowing to the majesty of Mother Earth. The wind behaved like a river, flowing on unseen currents, waiting to die out in peaceful waves and lapse over the draped hillsides. Everything appeared to be still, without blemish. Underneath the surface, however, something sinister was unraveling. The wind began to change, violently thrashing its waves against the old forest conifers. Dark clouds ran over the skylit canvas of the heavens, blotting out the light of the moon. The wind grew ever fiercer, bending the forest trees beyond their threshold, casting them aside in their wake. A woman carrying a young child ran into the forest, holding the infant tightly against her chest. She ran against the raging winds, pressing forward into the heart of the forest. As she ran, a large tree fell before her, blocking the road ahead, casting its splintered fragments against the ground with a violent crash. The baby began to cry as she entered into the depths of the forest. The woman nurtured the little one, calming it as rain ruptured from the reserves of the clouds overhead. Lightning flashed against the ominous clouds, illuminating their intimidating shadows on the ground below. The woman sought shelter as she carried the babe tightly in her arms. The rain continued its deluge, dampening all other sounds besides the roar of thunder that shook the earth. A screech was heard against the steady driving force of rain, as was the sound of metal striking against metal. Horses neighed in the distance as their position rapidly approached the depths of the forest.
I got to give you a high five for that one because that is incredible. And you mentioned so this was not written when you were in 5th grade. This is a more recent.
This is more recent. So
And-
this is about...
and you can definitely see that more mature.
I want to say this is like a 4 or 5 years ago.
Okay, so it's still quite a while ago. So it'd be interesting to see how your writing style has shifted over the years.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't change anything about that. Just hearing it, I think it's really good.
And this is before the conflict, as you'll see,
Yeah.
gets into it. when I was kind of like trying to cut off a certain time, I'm like, I can't cut it off. I know what comes next. I like what comes next.
Yeah.
But I had to cut it off somewhere, so I cut it off there.
For sure. But I think that is a perfect example of kind of that poetic prose.
Yeah.
The way that the scenery was described, you could feel it, you could see it, you could almost smell the surroundings. And maybe that's an exaggeration because I don't know. I thought you did a really good job describing it. So bravo to you for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've been kind of waiting to hear that prologue for a while because you told me for a long time. I love my prologue. I love my prologue. I'm not going to change my prologue. And now I know.
I really have no... It's very rare for me to say that I like it and I will not change it.
Yeah.
This is one of the rare instances where it's like, I don't really see much of a problem with it. And my idea with prologues moving forward. So basically, this is, obviously, it's a prologue. So this is in the character's past in some way or form. And informs the reader kind of the events that transpired. But as we'll find out, so in the future books, the prologue goes even further back and further back. So you're given basically the ending of what the prologue is. But in the next book, you'll go even further back. So you'll learn a little bit more as to why these things transpire. And then in the last prologue of it shows really what happens. And kind of leads into what the end of the second book is and getting into the third.
Yeah, and that's just a really cool idea in general.
Because then you really get and understand what happened.
It's like you're slowly
again, it goes back to the thing of your character is learning things as they go. And kind of how it was going to end the second book. And the first book is with a vision that ties in prologue of the next.
Very cool.
Which I don't know if it's been done before, but I really like the idea, and I think I did a very good job at the first one.
Yeah, just keep it up, see what happens. I mean, I think it's a great idea. Yeah, kind of going back into the nitty-gritty of the story. Your character, I mean, the characters in almost any story, they are the focal point.
Yeah.
So let's just get into the focal point. Who is our cast of characters in this Winds of Change series? Let's start with the main protagonist and then kind of go through the rest of the cast.
So there's obviously a whole cast of people.
Yes.
Yeah. Again, going from like Lord of the Rings, there's a bunch of characters that have little bits and pieces that are important.
That they kind of see on their journey.
And one thing that I wanted to maintain is the people I name are important. If they do not have a name, they don't really have importance. Aside from in the prologue. I do not name one person in the prologue. They share a very pivotal point, but it's an intentional leaving out of the name because it's important.
So it's almost like this, it's this subversion of what your expectations would be throughout the rest of the story a little bit.
Yeah, so it's a little bit different, but everybody else in the story that is not named is not important. Sorry to all those characters.
You don't matter.
Most of those characters, unfortunately, probably die. Just how it ends up being. Sorry.
You've mentioned the hero's name or the heroine's name earlier in this discussion.
So that's Ariel.
Ariel. So tell us a little bit about Ariel. What is the inspiration behind her? What's a little bit of her story?
To be honest, and obviously I have two characters that obviously stayed from 5th grade,
yes.
Which is Laressa and Ariel.
Yeah, and I want to get to Laressa in a minute, but
both of them share aspects of me. Ariel is probably very heavily me inspired. As to why she's female, I just think it's much easier to write female characters than male. I've always struggled writing male characters. I don't know why, considering I'm a male. But I feel like it's kind of hard to write because I have like probably one of my stronger male characters is Arcus, who we'll
touch on.
He doesn't really have a lot of character. To be honest. And honestly, I find that as a problem of most of my characters currently, which is why I'm changing a lot of how they speak and dialogue's been really challenging for me. So coming up with a dialogue, I can come up with great poetic prose, but when it comes to like dialogue, I'm a little lacking because socially I've never actually really been all that great at like communicating with others. So
you kind of see that as a reflection.
you see that as a reflection in the writing because I've not really been all that comfortable with it myself.
Okay.
So that's a little bit of my
Yeah.
current issues and trying to inject character into my characters. So Ariel, main character. There's really nothing like quote unquote special about her.
Interesting.
I mean, I'll get into this in the chapter 1 excerpt.
Yeah.
As she's viewed as something special.
Okay.
But she views it differently.
Interesting.
And then Larissa is the normalest of normal people you could ever have. So for my kind of inspiration behind them is Frodo and Sam.
Interesting.
from
So
the
is it
Lord
a
of the
similar
Rings.
relationship that?
It's a very similar relationship.
Yeah, because that would be my next question: is what is the relationship between these two characters? But they're friends, is what I'm.
So basically, Frodo is Ariel.
Okay.
Sam is Larissa.
Yes.
It's the same thing. Both like Sam and Frodo were male. Oh, this is the inverse of it. They're both female, but they share a very similar role. Yeah.
So I guess.
So those are the main two that you focus in on.
Yeah.
Other important characters, which I introduced later: Arcus, Agaricus, Beator. I haven't really introduced a whole lot of. There's a lot of side characters.
Sure.
I'll say there's a lot of side characters, but like main party. And then one person I just introduced recently is Amy.
Okay.
AMI. That's her name. Really like her character. Dacia is also a character. She's that mystery one.
Interesting.
Which definitely plays a pivotal role.
Very
later.
spoilery.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And what's her name again? Dacia?
Dacia.
Okay.
Which, fun fact, my 9th grade English teacher wanted to be a part of the story. So, there you are. You are in the story, Mrs. Alba. Welcome to the story, Dacia.
That's funny.
Unfortunately, your character has gone through things. I am so sorry. Probably one of the more depressing backstories that I have.
Yeah, so
Now, I don't want to give away the backstory because it does contain spoilers for the main plot.
yeah.
So I will abstain from it, but know that it's incredibly depressing.
Yeah. As we continue this kind of discussion on characters, one of the things that, as we've discussed outside of this podcast, your characters have incredibly depressing backstories.
Yeah, they have very dark backstories, a whole lot of them, including the main character.
Well, and this, obviously, I don't want to jump too heavy into any spoilers, but is there any, like a little taste that you can give us of their backstory without giving too much away?
Like, I can...
And you're allowed to say no.
No, I will actually say Dacia's backstory. Except, Dacia has 2 backstories, because she's alive twice.
Interesting.
Because she's a forest dryad, is what she is currently. She never was that to begin with. And the reason why is because of her first backstory. So her first backstory, and I kind of got this a little bit from watching anime a little bit. So I can't say they're all unique ideas here. But basically, Dacia was in a family. She was a human girl. A family of like 17 or something like that with a bunch of mouths to feed. They were poor. They couldn't afford anything. They couldn't get any food or drink or anything of the sort. So they cast her into the forest where she starved and...
Very dark.
She starved and basically died in the forest. Other forest dryad came along, revived her, basically planting her seed or something in it. So she became a forest dryad. This was thousands of years before the events of the main story.
Okay.
So she's old.
Very, very.
She
very
has plot relevance, we'll say. She's been there a bit.
Yeah.
So she's seen some things. Yeah, that's the initial backstory, not including the actual spoiler-heavy backstory bit.
For sure.
So that's only one part of how bad it is. It gets worse.
It's a whole downward spiral.
Amy also has a really bad backstory. I really like the character though, but it also tends to be kind of a kleptomaniac. So
Obsessed with thievery.
mainly because of her upbringing.
Interesting.
Though basically her family was basically murked by thieves. And the thieves became her de facto family. Okay. Whether it's by coercion or whatever.
Sure.
Kind of turns into that. She didn't really know anything different. She was young. I do an awesome scene later in the thing where
it's
cool.
It's a little bit like you take that nature versus nurture thing, and
yeah,
it's the nurture side.
There's a lot of, and I basically paint it as if the thieves weren't necessarily bad, but they weren't good either.
Right.
But it's kind of all these different aspects of everybody struggles with something. So a lot of my characters have bad backstories.
Yeah.
The one that has, like, I guess the most tame backstory is Larissa.
Which comes, kind of from that idea that she's the most
most normal.
So I guess, and this is, I obviously don't know too much. Somebody was just walking outside of the room.
Yeah.
But they've got all these traumatic backstories. Is this a symptom of just wanting to create a dark fantasy world? Is there something more there?
I think a lot of it stems, again, kind of how Tolkien and C.S. Lewis almost wrote, in an escapism faction. So a lot of some of the problems and everything, it's almost kind of vented on some of these characters, bless their hearts, where they go through a lot of stuff, because I was going through a lot of stuff as I was writing some of these.
Comfortable sharing any of that?
If not,
totally okay.
Some of it was like bullying or different things, or social isolation before, social distancing was a thing.
Right.
Where, why are you friends with these people? Like, you should have better friends than that. Or different things like that. And me sticking up for them became, okay. Well, then he volunteered himself to be kind of the whipping horse.
Yeah. So
that's kind of what it turned into, but I bottled all of it inside, which is not smart. Do not do that. Bad idea. But I kind of vented a little bit, and honestly, if I didn't vent it into the story, I might not even be here right now.
Interesting.
It was
you kind of let it fester otherwise, and it becomes something that's almost uncomfortable.
So I apologize for my characters, but I also thank them for taking the brunt of the damage.
That's a totally fair thing, because you're not the first writer to say, my writing is an escape. I think a lot of us could say that. And if it was a way to find healing from pain in your personal life, I think that's totally valid. Yeah. And it's incredible that you were able to do that, to be able to, yes, it sucks for your characters, but they are fictional. And it does create an intriguing backstory, but it was a way for you to say, what's going on over here, this is my way of getting it out in a healthy way that isn't gonna, I don't even know where I'm going with this, but I think you understand. So you talked a little bit about your main protagonist, and you talked a little bit about a chapter 1 excerpt. Yeah. So you've got your phone pulled up. Yeah. I'm assuming you want to go there next. So we're gonna dive right into that.
So this gives a little bit more character into Ariel. So my main character, or the one that you read from the perspective of, because it's written in first person. This is the main person you're reading the lens through. So, and this is kind of a snapshot I guess, into some of her inner struggles. Obviously, this is chapter 1, so obviously it's still subject to change since chapter 1 isn't exactly the greatest for me, and you'll see why probably, but
And was this a chapter that was written when you were in 5th grade or
sixth grade.
Sixth grade.
Sixth
Okay.
grade. But I've done like edits here and there, so some of it's like it's kind of an edited mess. So we'll see.
Hey,
A good majority of chapter 1 was reworked. So there's a good majority that's fine, especially right after the prologue. It flows seamlessly from one to the other. But then you get into 5th grade me. Woo! Woo! You did a job. You did a job, and it's gonna be hard to fix. But we'll get there. But anyway, this is a little bit of a snapshot. So yeah. So the tribe began to accept me several years back after a terrible famine swept through our land. Before the famine, I never felt I belonged in the tribe. I always felt different, disjointed from the rest. I would watch people come and go from my life. There was never a moment I didn't feel alone. As I grew older, the people I knew well came to pass, seemingly aging 10 times as fast as myself. Tried everything I could to fit in, even going so far as to putting my life on the line for the tribe. Though the tribe elders would not allow me to do so. They would not send a little girl into battle against men who could attack the tribe. I felt useless. I knew something was different about me, but I didn't understand why. Why me? What did I do to deserve such a thing as this? It felt like torture. People would look at me with disdain, and some would pamper me for being different, even so far as depicting me as a goddess who was sent to watch over the tribe. Thing is, I never felt like a goddess. I felt alone. If a goddess is truly what I am, I do not know if being a goddess is such a pleasant reality. When the famine came, an opportunity arose to prove my worth to the tribe. The famine struck hard. The tribe's food reserves were low, and the animals our hunters depended on had vanished. The crops we grew were scarce. It looked as if the tribe would have to move deeper into the Genovian woods. I decided to venture into the forest and hunt what I could for the tribe, grabbing my yew bow and a handful of homemade wooden arrows for the hunt. It was therapeutic for me. I felt alive within the forest. There were no glancing looks. There were no feelings of being held back. It felt great to be able to do something for the tribe that took me in. I only wished I could have helped sooner.
I really like it. I mean, for something that's been written by a 6th grader, I wouldn't have known unless you told me. I know because you told me.
I mean, some of the edits made
Sure.
it seem a lot better because it was a lot worse, let me tell you.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier with Ariel, there is something different about her. And that was something that was emphasized in that passage a little bit I caught on.
Yep.
Is that something you can speak to, or is that
Yes.
like can't talk about it?
So, what she'll find out later, told by Arcus, is she's a half-elf.
Okay.
The rest of the tribe's human. They don't live as long as half-elves.
Right.
And she ages a lot slower. So she matures a lot slower.
Interesting.
So by this time in the story, she's about 112.
And she doesn't really realize
She
that
looks like a teenager,
yet. Okay.
but she's 112. Or something around the line. I actually have a timeline. I can't remember the exact age she is, but I have a timeline. So I know how old she is. But
Does she doesn't know at this point she's a half elf, but she knows there's
no,
something
not at this point.
at this point in the story.
Because she's only been surrounded by humans.
Right.
Who deify her because she lives so much longer and seemingly does things perfectly. Which is why they deify her, and some are just jealous of
So
the
it's
fact.
it's this weird,
So there's
I
some
don't
in the
really
tribe
know
that
what's
look
going
at her.
on,
Yeah.
but there is something.
There's
weird
something
happening.
going on. Why do I live a whole lot longer? Like, it's some of those questions that arise, and I think anybody would ask those questions.
And this kind of leads me into another question, and maybe it's something you've answered, maybe it's something you're going to answer, or maybe you haven't even thought of. If somebody is living that long, they've obviously seen friends, family pass on.
Mm-hmm.
I would assume this has
It has
severely
toll.
affected her psyche, and
It has a toll.
yeah,
It has a toll. It's kind of the age-old question of what would you like if you were to live forever, would you? If you could have immortality, would you? And it's kind of getting at that a little bit. Obviously, half elves are not immortal.
Mhm.
They will eventually die. However, it may be hundreds or thousands of years before they do, and unfortunately, humans do not live that long.
Yeah.
So she's had friends in the past, one of them being the village elder, which initially I named Hondasa, but I changed it because of the apostrophe. I wanted to make it look tribal.
Mhm.
But then, like, the name of the tribe I initially had was actually a tribal name that I didn't even know existed. In like,
Interesting.
it was the Mukasori,
Mhm.
is what I had the tribe named at first. And I'm like, oh, that's actually a tribe. Oh, oops. I'm just gonna change it. Didn't know that. I made it up on the spot.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I might put Hondasa back just because I know him as Hondasa instead of Dominic,
Yeah.
which is the new name I have. It's not the same.
Yeah.
Hondasa is named because he's important. Again, being very familial with Ariel. Basically was, or kind of is, the father figure currently.
Sure.
Even though basically she knew him since he was a baby.
Interesting.
He is no spring chicken anymore. He's a little bit older now, as in nearing the end of his life.
Yeah.
But yeah, to see some people, like the first wave of people that took after her are all gone.
Mhm.
And then the famine took out a bunch. So basically, everyone from kind of the famine onward do not know from when she came into the tribe.
She's just been there.
She's always been there.
Interesting. And that you mentioned a lot of things, and so I'm going to kind of pivot the conversation away from characters for a moment, because you mentioned a lot of things in there: tribes, half elves, humans. I mean, all these things that brings me into this question of what is the world that these characters are living in? What's the name of it, if you have one? And just give us kind of a brief rundown.
It needs a new name to be
It
honest.
needs a new name. You heard it here first. Put in the comments the new name for Brandon's world.
But I have different ideas. But like the current name as it is right now is Gurks.
Gurks.
So GERTX.
What was the inspiration behind that?
There is none.
You just
It's
realized
just random typing on the keyboard, whatever
Gurks.
whatever fits. That's kind of how I named initially some of my first names.
Okay.
So Hondasa, different characters like that were all bleh.
Yeah.
So is there any fancy reasoning for the names? Not at all. Except for a handful, which I got later. So Agaricus has a meaning behind the name. Arcus has a meaning behind the name. Beator has a meaning.
Yeah.
So some of these other characters have meaning in their names. It's just the first batch do not.
So the world of Gurks, as that's just what I'm going to call it for the sake of conversation. Give me a little snapshot of what it's like. What is life like in Gurks? You know,
So it's very medieval.
very medieval.
So
Medieval Europe, kind of feudal, sort of Eastern.
everything's bow and arrow, swords. There is magic, but it's on the down low.
Okay.
It's not heavily prevalent. It's no Harry Potter.
Okay.
Let's say.
So it's there, but it's not,
It's
full.
not. It's not the focus,
Okay.
but it does exist. everybody in the world can use magic.
Mm.
Most don't know how.
Interesting.
It's more this ancient thing, so people that study it would know it. Agaricus being one of them. He's one of the. You would call him, I guess, if you played like D&D, he would be like a sage.
Mm.
Or something like that. Where he's not very tall. He's maybe a foot tall. He's a gnome. He's a forest gnome. Can do a lot of damage.
Yeah.
But he doesn't like using magic.
So
It's just funny characters like that. Like, he's the sage who doesn't like using magic at all. Mainly because he has, again, not a great backstory, as in he's accidentally hurt many people, including the death of basically his whole entire training class that he caused himself. And he's like, I'm going to not use this as much.
So, Gerx, it's very medieval inspired. What would you say is the most interesting part about this world?
Like, for something, I would say it's very similar to Game of Thrones.
Okay.
In some instances. And also Lord of the Rings to others, like especially for the elves.
Yeah.
And like dwarves. But especially for human, Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
And basically because initially how I wrote the world in 5th grade is it was an island. It was an island nation, kind of like Hawaii. It's not that anymore, but it's still island-like. So it serves a central.
So is it like an archipelago though?
Yeah, it's more of an archipelago. So I basically split the map into 4 segments or 4 corners, let's say. And then I'm not saying like 4 kingdoms kind of esque, because I know that's a thing as well, but that's not the intention. So basically, the weather is different on Gerx. So one of the segments or quadrants is perpetually spring.
Okay.
One's perpetually winter. One's perpetually summer. One's perpetually fall.
Mm.
And in the middle, everything combines.
Interesting.
And that's viewed as a holy spot.
Yeah.
For everything coming together and being what we would view as normal. But it's very interesting in that way. And whether you want to call something like Total Conquest is something that, like at one point in time, there used to be complete domination over everything. And then over time that broken up and everything. So basically think of like the ancient world and how people fought back and forth and all the backstabbing, all that kind of, It's think of that. That is the world you are in.
And I think that's interesting.
And the tribes, they're kind of off on their own. And what I eventually tell people, and this is early in the story, so I'm not really giving much away. The tribes are actually offshoots of a broken human kingdom that used to be.
Interesting.
So they're the last remaining remnants of a kingdom that has fallen.
Of this almost ancient world, in a way.
Of one of these ancient civilizations. Though the characters do not know that.
Yeah. It's something you learn
later.
It's
something you learn later. Particularly has some meaning to Ariel and why she's there. Because her ancestry has ties to that kingdom.
Yeah.
But anyway.
So no, I think that's all incredibly interesting, especially the seasonal aspect of it. That's something that the way seasons are used in any sort of, whether it's literature or whatever, I think it's fascinating. So I dig that concept in particular. I think it's really cool.
I think it's just, I thought it was unique, so I went with it.
Yeah.
It doesn't really serve any purpose other than the fact that, Oh, in the middle of the world, guess what? All the seasons come together. Wow! Let's make it a holy spot.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've got two more major questions on the world. The first one, let's talk about that idea of a holy spot. So I'm assuming there is some sort of spirituality or religion
Yeah.
in this world.
So, though religion is never specified, people want this central location. Whether you think about it in terms of combat, because it's on a mountain, you have high ground.
Yeah.
It's known as like one of the mountain of the gods. So think of Mount Olympus in a way, where all the gods reside. So being at the top, because there used to be a civilization or a main capital right there that has since fallen, because of course it did. Think of that again as Jerusalem.
Interesting.
So there's a lot of different people clamoring after this capital or this location, just like Jerusalem. There's a lot of different religions that want Jerusalem as a mainstay.
Yeah.
So this particular plot of land is very sought after by multiple people. So it's basically a big fight for who gets the slice of the pie.
Yeah. And then my other major question regarding the world is we brought up the topic of different races in the world, from the elves and humans and dwarves. Is that all there is? Has it been mostly a focus on kind of your traditional fantasy races?
It's like your traditional fantasy races, but I wanted to be unique, so I had to include something a little bit different. So I created kind of this draconian group called the Valfiok.
Mm-hmm.
So, or the Valfian race, which are more draconic and more have ties to ancient things where they're a little bit unknown and they're not entirely viewed as good.
Okay.
So I do have dragons also, and draconian and dragon are completely different.
Yeah.
You can call the Valfiok almost imp-like, if you would.
Interesting.
Or I guess more akin to probably demon would be closer to what they are.
The kind of the image in my head is almost this mix between, for those who play like D&D, like a tiefling and a dragonborn.
Yeah.
Is that kind of the vibe you're going for?
Kind of a little bit, yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, so I think those are the major things I wanted to cover regarding the world. Now, obviously, there's a heavy faith influence with this podcast. And so I'm curious, and I'm sure our viewers are curious, what is the faith-based influence, if there is any, on this story? Because I know you mentioned kind of this.
There's subtle things, kind of like the Jerusalem.
Right, and that's, I guess, what I'm curious about. Is it more of a historical sort of influence, or is there a personal?
It's more of a discovery kind. It's very subtle. I wouldn't say there's blatant things in the story.
It's not like a C.S. Lewis.
No, it's not. It's more of a Tolkien, and there's aspects of like either the characters and what they go through, or different things in the world that point toward more of a Christian idea or theme, but isn't blatantly Christian.
Okay. And what was there how do I want to phrase this? Was that by design, or was that just something that happened naturally as you were writing?
At first it kind of happened naturally, as in I wasn't intending it to have anything really. It was just kind of a way to
writing
write
a story.
Yeah. It's just kind of writing a story, and then I found out it started going in that direction, and I kind of led into it, kind of similarly to Tolkien, because Tolkien initially didn't write it faith-based either.
Right.
And it just kind of happened to go in that kind of direction, though mine is not overtly Christian.
Okay.
In its base. It's more of I like fantasy. Let's dive into a fantasy.
And you just kind of see that those faith that kind of your faith start to almost naturally, you see it influence.
You'll see bits and pieces of it in places.
Right. But it's
It's
not
not
this.
going to be super obvious, like you wouldn't have known the other if I didn't say it.
Right. And I think that's a good way of doing it, though, because it doesn't come off as let me ram this down your throat. Not to say that that felt what C.S. Lewis was doing was the case, but because there's obviously a place for both. But I think that's a valid way of writing the story. And we are starting to run a little low on time. And I know you had a third excerpt, so kind of preface that excerpt a little bit so we know kind of.
So this is chapter 7.
Yeah.
So this is a ways down in the journey when they've left the village already and left the tribe. So the characters here, we have Ariel, Larissa, obviously. Then you have Dacia and Agaricus.
Okay.
So Dacia, the forest dryad, they don't know that. Agaricus, the forest gnome, who's kind of underground at the moment. And then obviously your main two. That I kind of briefly explained the origin.
Yeah.
Obviously not so much the main character, Ariel, because there's a lot more to that that's more plot related. So they're underground. They're stuck underground after something happened with Dacia. So they're underground. They're trying to find their way back out. They find Agaricus locked down here, tending to his mushrooms. Because he's
I love that.
he's the son of a chef or a cook. Yeah. Like his mom was a very prevalent cook. So he's tending to the, and then he locked basically his cellar behind him. He's like, oh crap, oh no. So he's stuck down there, tending to his mushrooms. And the way I named the gnomes is I named them because they all have some kind of plant life in their hat, if you will.
Okay.
Their hood. Think of garden gnomes as you would. They normally have this hat.
The pointy,
So they have something in their hat that symbolizes what their name is.
Interesting.
So Agaricus is a scientific name for a glowing mushroom.
That's fun.
So that's his name. Yeah. So he has a meaning behind the name, and it kind of fits with how you first interact and meet the character. I just thought it was fun. Anyways. So in the underground is more of this unknown commodity in the world, as in we don't know why the underground is there. There's passages and corridors, and think of a dungeon in Dungeons and Dragons. We don't know why it's there, but it's there, and it connects all parts of the continent.
Interesting.
And there's more to the underground, which I'm not going to get into. But it almost is a metaphor for the inside of your mind, which is kind of what a lot of the enemies in here feed off of. Which you'll see one of them in this excerpt. So I'm going to read it. Because this is something I edited. So the interaction that used to be here, I changed heavily. This is more recent.
Okay.
Of a change. Some of the bits aren't, but especially the interaction that you'll see at the end of it is more of a recent. Or I say recent, again, it's like that 5-year whatever back then.
Right.
Anyways, I'll get into it. So they are, again, giving a little bit more context. They're in a corridor. They came to a dead end. Or not dead end, but they're stuck. They need to move forward, but they can't.
Yeah.
So I heard an echoing boom that shook the very walls, trembling with each passing moment. The creature roared, causing the light that absorbed to erupt into flame around its body. So they come into contact with one of these creatures that I mentioned before. With every breath, the flames rose and fell, causing the room to light and become dim with each passing second. Could not make out many details, for the creature was covered in a blaze. The body had no form. I could only see its glowing red eyes, glaring straight into my soul. Out from the cloaked fiery veil emerged two arms with sharp claws that could cut the night sky, blades of shadow. All of a sudden, the beast thrust its claws toward me. I was caught firmly in its grasp. I could not move. Its claws tore into my back, piercing the wound I had received from the hellhound. Another previous encounter. My back began burning as I lifted my head in agony, screaming in pain. I was defenseless. Ariel! Larissa cried. Do something! The beast let out a deep, menacing laugh that shook the very room. She cannot do anything. You can do nothing. See the fire burning. See the fear that lurks inside. See the death that lingers in the dark. None can escape its grasp once it grabs hold. A great power is dwelling in the depths unseen, seeking and destroying. Lurking in the shadows, it rises, blotting out the land that blotting out the light that once contained it. Out of its shackles, it roams once more to bring the land once again back into its own. War on the inside, a monster within us all, and all will soon gather to its growing, sickening call. Darkened the world will be, all for the better. Don't you agree? Again, that's more of the rhyming aspect, but again, more that poetic nature.
Absolutely.
The beast cackled as the flames rose upon its form. I could feel the flames upon my back, the claws digging into me. Pain is all I felt. However, that was not the only effect the creature had. My sight began to grow dark, but as it did, I began to see a vision. I was standing outside, trees all around me. I looked up and the sky shone red, as balls of fire fell from the sky, engulfing the countryside around me. The flames surrounded me in a ring of fire. Glancing about, I noticed hundreds upon thousands of bodies littering the ground. A shadow quickly advanced toward my direction, a form from the depths, opening its maw to show serrated, shadowy teeth. Two paths. One you can take, one you can make, each with its own consequence. A knife dipped in blood, a head in the sky. Take your shot, let it fly. The teeth sank into my flesh. I collapsed on the cobble, my vision darkened as my skin felt as cold as death itself. I could not move. I could barely breathe. All I could do was listen. Larissa began screaming my name. Ariel! Ariel! No! I could hear feet running on the stone floor, hastening in my direction. At that time, my back throbbed with pain as my skin began to burn. Dacian Agaricus began shouting, cursing the beast of fire, but all it did was cause the pain to intensify. It seemed as if the creature fed on anger, on fear. My eyes began to reopen. The creature was above me, the flames licking the surface of my skin. I saw the fire in Larissa's eyes, a fire that was not of the creature, but within herself. She slowly backed towards the skeleton, and the skeleton was in the room. There was a sword by the skeleton, for context. Wanted to have so much more on this too. And took the sword from its resting place. the sword shearing the bony fingers from their placement. The beast immediately took notice. She took the blade and swung it at the creature. The blade's edge followed its course and sliced through one of the eyes of fire. She screamed, or nope, skipped it a bit. Upon doing so, the beast roared in anger, causing the flames to grow in power. The menace took its claws and slashed at her, causing her to drop the sword. A loud ping reverberated across the small, dank room. She screamed in pain as the beast pierced her flesh, blood trickling down her side. Strength out of nowhere awakened within me. The burden vanquished in the moment. My eyes shot open and my body jerked forward as I saw myself standing upright. "You are not taking her away from me!" I grasped the fallen sword and drove it through the other fiery eyes it turned to face me. The beast screamed in agony, the form writhing about, the screams ear-shattering in volume. It then burst into a void of shadow, slowly seeping back into the ground.
I loved it. I think that's great.
Again, it kind of shows a little bit. Again, that metaphor of the inside demons that we kind of have. And obviously some of this alludes to things that will happen in the future. So for those, so here you go, forewarning or foreshadowing of things that will happen later. It's my subtle way of putting it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it gives more of an idea into some of the character and what the main character is kind of going through.
For sure.
There's a lot of inner turmoil. Again, it kind of relates again the excerpt I read before.
Right.
Chapter 1, everybody's kind of passing on before me.
Mm-hmm. And now you're starting to see that struggle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
I know
as much as I'd love to keep going, we only have about 5 minutes left. So I do basic question before we wrap up. Where are you in terms of the writing process with the story?
Yeah.
And what are your hopes for this story? Maybe that's probably obvious,
Yeah.
but just so that you can vocalize it to the world.
So it's been a long journey for writing the story. I am a couple of chapters short of being done with writing the first book.
Okay.
Though editing is very much needed.
It's a different monster altogether.
That's a different issue. Obviously, these are little excerpts that I think are more indicative of what the end product I would like it to be. And some of the later stuff is much better than the prior stuff. I do have a lot of fight scenes. I think I do fight scenes fairly well. Dialogue is its own animal.
That is for certain.
So that's one of the issue areas I have.
Dialogue is, I mean, like I said, it's its own animal because it's difficult to write, I think, for anybody.
But again, you see the imagery, the poetic prose that I write in.
Yeah.
That's very evident, as you'll see in the story. Is it over stimulating or different things than that? I feel like maybe it could be at times. So I almost want to dial it back a bit. But in different instances and situations of high intensity, I think they're valid. But anyway, that's just this. It's just a taste, and obviously we can do a lot more of these videos later, including the ones that the one that Jonathan's been writing. And initially I have a plan of doing 3 books, so I'm almost done with book 1, which ends on a big plot change cliffhanger.
Everybody loves a cliffhanger.
That basically throws everything you've learned in the first book on its head. So I'm not going to
reveal that.
I am not going to reveal it. I wanted to show a fight. I wanted to read a fight scene so bad because I like it, because I'm very poetic in it.
Yeah.
And everything, but I didn't want to do it because the character is that important to the plot.
And like you said, I mean, if this is something that you guys are enjoying, I know I'm having a lot of fun with this conversation, and next week we'll talk a little bit about mine. But if this is something you want to see us continue talking about,
comment down below,
we
share.
will gladly do.
And honestly, we could do a whole series just on different ramblings of different things that we're thinking about with our story. We can even invite some of you into some of that discussion. Mm-hmm. Or we can just kind of go into the different things that we've written. Mm-hmm. So I have things other than the story that I've written.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this story was the focal point. And that was the intention for today. And obviously next week it'll be the focal point of that week. But we've written a lot of other things, and we'd love to share more about that if that's something you guys are interested in. But for the sake of time, unfortunately, we do have to wrap it up. So I just want to thank Brandon again it takes a lot of courage to even speak about writing because it's something that's so personal.
Yeah, so it can be personal. Yeah. But in another way, it's been awesome to be able to kind of do some of these things. And nobody has really wanted to read or kind of critique my writing because they're like, oh, it's great. And I'm like, that's not helpful.
Yeah.
Or different things like that. Or, oh, it's too long. I don't want to read all that, and critique it that way. So even if it's just us two kind of talking, it would be kind of nice to kind of get a perspective of kind of where things are at. Obviously, I brought some of my better stuff forward, but you can tell the potential, I think,
absolutely,
with some of the writing that I have.
And I hope just this conversation, it excites you to finish this first book, you know? Yeah. I say this as somebody who struggles with it myself. Don't worry about the editing until you're done. I'm somebody who edits as I go, and that is a dangerous process.
I want to say I've gotten rid of at least 7 chapters of material editing and redoing. So there's full chapters that are literally reworked.
Yeah.
Some are full on deleted.
Just Control-Alt.
So anyway, that is it for this video. Tune us in for next week when we talk about Jonathan's story.
Really excited about it, guys. Thanks for tuning in.
Yep, thanks for tuning in, and we will catch you on the flip side.